As we go through how each skill was developed in the Birthing Better childbirth preparation, skills-based approach to childbirth, you need to understand that the fathers and mothers who developed these skills did so for their own birth. That meant many of them had already given birth, with or without skills, and many were first-time mothers and fathers. Of these families that had given birth, all their births were different. Some had labored and given vaginal birth at home or in a birth center in a hospital, with or without lots of medical assessments, monitoring procedures with a doctor or a midwife or another care provider. Others had had unplanned surgical cesareans or had planned non-laboring cesareans. What fathers and mothers knew about their pregnancy and their birth was that their baby's birth was important to them. They really didn't care about anybody else's birth. They cared about their own birth. And every family wants to have a good birth, an empowered birth, a meaningful birth, a birth in which the memories that last a lifetime are good to look back on and to think about and to tell other people about. And this is why I've carried all of this forward and I'm talking to you today. One of the skills that was developed was this concept about birthing behaviors. Without a doubt, when these skills were first developed in the early 1970s, we were giving birth in the United States within a skills-based childbirth concept, which was what we call the childbirth concept number 2, because the global childbirth concept number 1 was always going to be present. You never know what your birth is going to be like. You just don't. It's almost always different from what you imagine. And if we'd given birth before, we knew we remembered the births. Because we were birthing during a skills-based childbirth trend, we knew what the skills were that we were learning, which were Lamaze and Bradley. They weren't sufficient. Mostly, they just weren't enough of them. They focused on breathing and relaxation. We didn't have skills around how to effectively communicate with our partner, who is our coach, or with ourselves, and when our mind said all sorts of things. We didn't necessarily have effective skills in order to keep the labor progressing, so we didn't have a long labor. We didn't have good skills about touch, so touch was often irritating to us when we were focusing. We didn't have a lot of skills, and we wanted more of them. And we wanted skills that adjusted and adapted and that were sustainable throughout our birth experience, no matter how it unfolded. And what we understood, because back then, none of us had choices. It was all about what we were doing. And what was remarkable during that period of time was that the feedback from obstetricians and obstetrical nurses in the United States, when Lamaze and Bradley was being taught everywhere, was that care providers in the United States were delighted to be seeing families working together and women coping better. Because prior to when fathers were accepted into the hospital, we as women were left alone. And prior to fathers being accepted in the hospital was prior to the skills-based approach to childbirth. And that meant throughout time and place, women have birthed without skills. So what is their behavior? It's reactive to what is happening to them and around them and the sensations they feel within inside themselves. Skills gave us the ability to apply skills, at least in breathing and relaxation, no matter what was happening to us or around us or the sensations inside us. In other words, birth was no longer just happening to us. We were now doing it, and our behaviors were seen and heard by people around us. And this is what obstetricians and obstetrical nurses loved. They loved seeing and hearing us cope better. And they loved having fathers know how to help us stay in control and manage better and to work through the activity as our birth unfolded. What we experienced back in the 1970s was that we had 4 elements to our birth stories. The first element, we all know what time things happened. My water bag broke. We drove to the hospital. We had our baby. It took me hours. The second element was what we were hearing personally, what they did or didn't do to me. And that could range from my obstetrician was wonderful, to my husband was a jerk, to my husband was wonderful, to the obstetrician was a jerk, or the care that I got I loved, or they were rough with me. And the third element was what we felt. I had terrible back labor. I didn't expect to have an unplanned cesarean. I vomited a lot through the labor. I found it fine. Everybody told me it was a nightmare. It was easy for me. Those are the three elements we hear in birth stories even today. But in the 1970s, there was a fourth element, and that element had to do with our behaviors, what we did. At every contraction, I found that the breathing really helped me. Or the breathing didn't continue to help me as the contractions got more intense. Or I could really help her relax at the beginning part of labor, but as labor picked up, it was harder to get her to relax. Those are birthing behaviors. Those are applying skills, whether they're working or they're not working. And so now you understand why Birthing Better families wanted more adaptable and adjustable, sustainable skills. And the fourth element also included the questions. What could I have done to get my labor going? What could I have done to slow down this intense labor that made me feel I was going to die? I had terrible back labor. Was there anything that I could have done? Or from a father's viewpoint, I knew she needed help, but I wasn't certain how to help her. Or she wasn't clear with me, so I didn't know how to help her. And what we discovered back then in the 70s up until the 1980s was the communication between us as a mother and father, or a mother and other, was absolutely essential. The person who was seeing and hearing us didn't want to see or hear us get out of control. And sometimes being in control and feeling out of control could happen in a nanosecond, depending on how intense and quickly a contraction came on or got more intense. But as we learned more skills at a time in the United States where 95% of us were laboring because cesareans were such major abdominal surgery and done only to save our lives, we had to labor. We didn't have choices. And so we had to get through it. And what we decided as Birthing Better families was that women really wanted to say this about their birth afterwards. No one knew more about my birth than I did. And what fathers and others wanted to say after a birth was, I absolutely knew that I could help her moment to moment, and she knew I knew. So what we knew back then was that birth happens. No woman gets out of pregnancy without giving birth. 100% of us are going to do it. So we have a choice. And we had a choice sort of back then, but we didn't understand that because skills were the only choice. And we all rushed to the classes because we were the first generation that had skills applied to birth. Just think about it. It took until the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for there to be a set of universal skills. We can't blame Lamaze and Bradley for not having a sophisticated set of skills. They were just starting to show us that anyone could really use skills while they were giving birth. But sadly, as I've talked about in other videos, these three wonderful obstetricians, Grantley Dick Reed included, who wrote Childbirth Without Fear, is that they really were focused on low-risk women, not the rest of us. And they were not focused on whether we could cope better, which is the global goal number 2, suffering. But instead they were focused on the type of birth, that it was going to be natural. But nobody had clarified what that word meant. And that it was going to be pain-free, because Grantley Dick Reed said that was possible, and some women do have relatively pain-free births, and that it would all be done without medical care, which for women who were post-World War II and 2 or 3 generations away from having lived traditionally and having modern health care being relatively new, most women were not going to go back to birthing in a village. They wanted modern conveniences. They wanted to have life be easier and not such a struggle, and that included in their birth. So when we look at birthing behaviors, that really was a collective set of skills that Birthing Better families developed. We wanted to behave better, and behaving better meant that we wanted to be able to work through, cope, deal with, handle, stay on top of and feeling control of ourselves as labor progressed, because there was no way to know what our birth was going to be like. Even as it's unfolding, we don't know how long it's going to last until our baby is born. So those birthing behaviors, those skills, had to adjust, be adaptable, and be sustainable throughout that experience. And when we applied our skills throughout the experience, we felt empowered. And our families grew in strength because we worked together during this transition from pregnancy to parenting, which was the birth of our baby.